best friend.
Do you be more mad at your best
That
friend?
question doesn't work.
Yeah. You be more mad at your best friend.
Right, but they're not your best friend.
But no, you said,
Right,
no, I'd be proud of my best friend.
Really?
He got the girl.
I think that's probably
Every kid does that. They shave their head and then they so you would be okay?
No, I wouldn't be okay, but I'm not a person who like gets angry at people or actions. I'd be annoyed at actions. I wouldn't be like,
Gosh, you're 13. I would be mad
I'd
at
be like, dude, why did you do that?
My best friends wouldn't do that.
Right, that's
If
also
it wasn't a joke.
Also, you don't have a girlfriend. So
that's also true. I picked to be around people who are that I'm not.
Unless it was a joke or a bit.
or you were testing me. Like you paid your money.
But if you had tested them, then you wouldn't be mad at your friends. You'd be mad at them because it was
Right. Yeah.
So
But
that's
if it
a
was
different
just
question.
hanging out until some
No, like my friend bet my other friend that he would try to hit on my girl. And he did. That's money earned. I don't care.
that's
It's a
different.
bet.
That's different. But if there's nothing to it, like he just goes up and he makes
Then they're not my best friend.
oh, we're back to this. So it is a fake friend. You said boys don't have fake friends.
Yeah, I don't.
I think that
No, he said boys don't.
Yeah, I don't. All my friends are.
Not you.
sorry,
But
he's saying that he doesn't have fake friends. Plenty of
everyone has fake. Anyone can.
fake people
Anyone can have fake friends.
And I will definitively say that as a kid.
They like jump scare about you. Kind of they betray you.
She's not a fake friend. She's not a fake friend.
What about me? What about me? Go! Guys, Elon loves me. He
These
brought me.
guys are you before you.
Can you bring me another cookie? I've seen you. I've interacted with you. I've interacted with you 2 days. That one Friday where I interacted with you. I forgot. I was best friend back.
No, because if I go.
Okay, we're gonna start as soon as everybody comes in.
Literally cost you nothing to say yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna go do something. I don't want that cops.
Yeah, I don't want to stay right there. I'm just staying here. But you wouldn't. We're having a lovely
I would.
Okay, everybody, you guys can stay here because we're just gonna start the door service up there, but we just have to wait for everybody to come in.
So we can just wait up here. Do I need my turn? Am I in trouble? Yeah. Do we need our turn? I brought it. We're staying here.
Where are we sitting? Are we just sitting here?
I have to come here. See? The blue one? You always said.
Yes. No, still.
Yeah, drop down.
Alright, it's after midnight. Let's go.
We're ready.
12:02.
Look at these
Alright,
ready
you're gonna have
people. I'm so good to forget. Yeah, I'm tired. Yes.
I just took like a nap and then I questioned the meeting.
To be supportive. I'm here to be supportive
What's going on?
of you guys.
Hey Dad, can you grab my Talib bag and just have it with you? It's literally on that chair right there. It's that one. I stuffed a lot of snacks in it, so because I'm smart. Just keep it with you.
For failure.
No. What did you do? Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. I can't go hit your head though.
Right, because it's on Saturday, right?
What is in your pocket? Then you have 3 pockets.
How can I get?
Give me
Sure, that would be great. You want to start? Yeah.
If you want me to, I can. I'm just going to tell people we're starting in 2 minutes.
Or 1 minute, even better.
right there. I can't. Oh, I didn't see
So are you good on your own, or you want me to be
Yeah,
up
but
here?
if you want to say something.
I've known you for 2 days. Why are we not close?
It's like, all right, hugs them in. We have some Shomrei, all kinds of Montclair teens here ready to lead us in our amazing midnight service. Keep in mind, it's midnight. We're all a little tired. Noah, can you come help lead the Torah service with everyone? They're gonna do this at midnight. You can do it too. Any other young or young at heart are welcome to lead us.
I think so.
You guys can go stand up there and open your heart. So we're gonna rise because in a moment our teens will open the ark.
Oh, okay, okay. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adoninu, Kadosh Shemo. Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adoninu, Kadosh Shemo. Gadol Adonai Iti, Umerom B'Shemo Yachdav.
Ready? Torah, 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 Torah. All right, thank you. And everyone else can be seated except for anyone who is reading Torah. You can get in your line up here.
Gotta get in line. Where's Zed?
Nala Amo, the Montclair teenagers. Okay, you want to find your...
Don't we need to see the prayer?
Yeah. Please find a spot first, okay?
Okay. So yeah, Zed. Baruch atah Adonai
Baruch Adonai HaBarach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam.
You all follow the
Asher banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
night after all.
Yeah.
Right here, sweet.
Anuhi Adonai Elohecha Asher Hotziticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Mi-Beit Avadim.
Lo yihiacha Elohim achirim Alfanai Lo Tasalecha Fesel V'chol Emunah Asher B'Shamayim Imal B'Asher B'Aretz Mitachat B'Asher B'Mayim Mitachat Ba'aretz.
Lo tishtahaveh lahem ve'lo tavdim ki Anohi Adonai Elohecha Elkanah Poked Avon Avot Abanim Ashlishim Ba'al Ribaim Lesonai Ve'oseh Hesed Lefalafim La'alafim La'ohavai Shomrei Mitzvotai.
Shomrei.
Lo tisa et Shem Adonai Elohecha Lashav ki lo Menakeh Adonai et Asher Yitzah et Shemo Lashav.
Zahor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod Ve'asita Chol Malachtecha
V'yom hashvi'i Shabbat L'Adonai Elohecha Lo tehaseh Chomelaha Ata Uvinha Uviteha Avdaha V'amata Uvhemteha V'gerha Asher B'shareha.
Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz et hayam ve'et kol asher bam vayanach bayom hashvi'i al kein beirach Adonai et yom hashabbat vaykadshehu kaberet aviha v'edimecha leman yarichun yamecha al ha'adama asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach.
Lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov, lo ta'aneh bre'acha et shaker, lo tachmod be're'echa, lo tachmod esher re'echa, v'avdo v'amato v'shoro v'chamoro v'chol asher l're'echa.
I, Adonai, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage.
You shall have no other gods besides me.
You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image, or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth.
You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, your God, Adonai, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me.
But showing kindness to the 1000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
You shall not swear falsely by the name of your God Adonai, for Adonai will not clear one who swears falsely by God's name.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy.
6 days you shall labor and do all your work.
For the 7th day is the Sabbath of your God Adonai. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements.
For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and then rested on the 7th day. Therefore Adonai blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that your God Adonai is deciding to you.
You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor.
You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's.
You guys make a big space behind me.
Careful of the chuppah.
Sorry, you okay?
I'm good. But she has to open the ark and you can say Eitz Chaim. You can put it away.
Sorry. It's late.
Eitz Chaim hi lama.
For the dedicated among us, there's one more session with Rabbi Dr. Jay Michaelson. We're just going to move the chuppah aside. We're going to stay right here and study some more Torah. We hope you can stay. You're welcome to eat cheesecake or whatever you need to do to stay awake.
We're going to be in here?
I think yeah.
No, sure they don't want. They want the break.
I don't know. I guess maybe they do.
They want the break.
I just asked Sarita.
Huh?
I just asked her, does she want the break? And she said no. And then she
And then she went to the break.
Do you want to speak in front of the podium?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Okay. We're starting in 10 minutes.
A little less, actually.
I have 12:19.
Oh, this is all for
We're starting in.
Also, I ended early.
I
ended 1 minute.
We're starting in 10 minutes.
And that's nice.
You could use this one, the
Oh
wireless.
my gosh, I thought I ended 1 minute late, and I ended 1 minute early because my clock is fast. Can't believe it.
Here is your wireless.
So I'm gonna fix it right now.
I used to have an alarm just looking exactly like that. You must have had that for a long time, because that is like an old style.
It is, but you can still get them.
You can?
I buy them like 3 or 4 at a time on Amazon. Cause
Why do you need so many?
They die and I lose them, and yeah.
It's already losing one little line.
I know, it's like,
yeah.
But I've tried other things. I don't have my phone in my room, in my bedroom, just for like hygiene,
Yeah.
hygiene,
Yeah.
digital hygiene. And so, yeah, not having that. And I got nervous that it's
It might be 10 minutes before people get the food that they
Well,
want.
when everybody went, I was just
Yeah.
called for 12:30.
Yeah.
Well, talk to Abba. I don't know about your walking home by yourself. So, or do you want to
great.
see someone's drive?
That was great. And that the way they arrived.
Well, she doesn't matter.
I want to get a ride. I don't want you walking by yourself. She's ready to go, but.
Oh, really?
No, we're going to do it. We're going to clean up after that. Because people are. There's one more thing? Yeah, there's a study. Don't you read your program?
But sweetie.
Bye, Tom. No.
Why didn't you actually read? When you just read for, I don't know, there was some cause.
No, I like
That was, I didn't.
But don't let that get away in those my head.
I grew up, Long Island, I was 9. And I was at USY. Did you ever have a congregation? No, I think that's like the hardest stuff. It might just be the hardest. Yeah, I'm more like the intonation. And I admire all the rabbis. Yeah, I see that. And then it was like later when because we did start to like, you don't pat yourself on the back. The family were like, you know, we don't have a rabbi. And we knew. So then it was not being the thing. Is there padding? Year and cool year. I don't like it. It feels good. Why can't you do it? You can do it. I'm not talking about you. Okay. Personality. I'll just say you got it. I got it. Yeah. I got into college that because really enriching because they make art action lessons. And also, I got into a college that is like in the state of disrepair at the moment. And just is letting it really I had it's not like I achieved some great feat. No, it wasn't the famous one. I read that book. Oh, I know that one. Yeah. His mom was there. And I was like, I know about you in the book. I was so excited. No, she comes off well. Yeah. Yeah, that was huge. That was a huge issue. I also wrote about it. You were right about it. It was clear they were getting support from, well, I'm pretty sure I know who was funding that. That's what I thought. What was so, but I just not your way so much. Their hands were so not clean. Yeah. And then they got a lot. Yeah, it was 8 people who wrote, like they said, they wrote protocols in the car for the Spanish. I mean, it was that's good. It was written, but then it didn't line up. It never lined up. But they clearly not. I mean, I read that book because I read their complaints, and that was the one where the complaints I could be bothered. Yeah, there was some funny targets around now like this. So I did the dive into that. Obviously, I think that's it's interesting. Like there's one like there's no such thing as I do too.
It's not that I don't want to talk about book banning.
You don't want to ban books? Why don't we just ban some books?
That's actually the live stream, so this is for...
I'm actually debating no miking,
No
except
mic
for the
for us
live
too.
stream, and so this does not, I'm just going to see if anyone needs it for accessibility. Can you help me with distributing that? Not to like deputize you to do stuff, but thank you. All right, this is the hardcore. Well, I have bad news because you're going to have to talk. Does anyone, for any reason, access hearing-wise, need me to use the microphone? I'd be happy to do that, but I'm also happy not to. This is the live stream one, but the amplified one in here? Okay, so far no. So we will not do it unless we need to do it. It was funny, like when I was like hardcore into my like Jewish stuff, all night Shavuot, 12:30 was like whatever. Like that's like the basic session. It was like the 4:30 session where you really had to push it out, like before the walk to the Kotel. Luckily, those Jewish macho days are behind me. So thank you for making it to the last session. So when I was putting this together, this was like the easiest one. I saved it to the end because I was working with Julie and asking like, well, what are people doing? Where are their gaps or whatever? And we talked about it. And then when I found out what the spaces were, oh, definitely I want to teach my favorite verse in the Torah. And that's what this is about. It's being the verse in various forms is being passed out to you. And we're going to do a kind of traditional format for this session, which is to say I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then you'll have an opportunity to break into chavruta, into either pairs or triads. whatever number works for you. And there are a couple of guiding questions. We'll look at the text, and then it's going to be a fun experiment because I'm curious if I have a particular couple of readings of this verse, and I didn't foreground what they might or might not be. So I'm curious to just find out, how it resonates for you. So here's the frame, and it's a pretty basic frame. Obviously, you can see the text of the verse in some of its different forms. I think so. If you zoom way, way back, the essence, the essential contribution of ethical monotheism, so Judaism and then its offshoots, Christianity, Islam, is the notion that somehow pleasing the deity and pursuing justice are connected, that God wants the good. This is not necessarily the case if you look, for example, at Greek mythology. There are some gods who want things that may or may be good for humans. And there's Athena, the goddess of justice, but there's not the notion that there is one force in the universe that is the big force, the big thing, and that force wants justice, wants more kindness, more compassion. You can also find, by the way, the reverse, where there is great texts about kindness and compassion, but it's not tied to monotheistic theology. And so if you zoom way, way, way back and you're a scholar of religion, you're like, okay. So for me, this verse, which appears in multiple forms, is a crystallization of that kernel of ethical monotheism. And yet we also know that we fail at it all the time, right? Not just Jews, not just people, but all human beings fail at this imperative. It's an ideal in a sense, but and maybe it's an ideal that knows that we'll fall short, but it's still worth aiming toward that ideal. And it's this interesting kind of dance, between, let's say, heaven and earth, or you could say between this ideal of reality of how we should be and the reality of how we are. So I'll go through the guiding questions and then set you free for a few minutes, and then we'll come back. My only other preface, so sometimes in the previous session, I think I was pretty clear, there's sometimes a desire to say, this is what Judaism says about, this is the Jewish teaching. And I want to be clear that that's not, Judaism says all kinds of things. We could come up with a theology just based on the most militaristic, mean-spirited verses of the Bible, and many people seem to be doing just that, exactly. So I'm not arguing that because I'm saying it's foundational. I think it is foundational to the kind of Jewish consciousness that I'm interested in, both spiritually and ethically, or in terms of justice. But I don't want to make some normative claim that I'm right and the bad guys are wrong. Of course, I am right, the bad guys are wrong, but I don't want to claim that. Just kidding. So a couple of the guiding questions, what's going on with these? I think this verse is deceptively simple, so that should be obvious, which is to say it's not as simple as it appears. Obviously, there's variations in how this is portrayed. So the first is the guiding question is comes from Rashi, the great biblical commentator Rashi. Rashi has a hermeneutical principle, an interpretive principle, that the Torah never wastes words. If the Torah says something or it doesn't say something, if there's a gap, that's a sign of something. That has to do with theology. I'm not necessarily interested in that, but literarily, the Torah does, it's interesting that there are words that may or may not have some function, and what's unusual about the textual economy of this verse, and then obviously what are the differences, and not just obviously this one uses this word, this one uses the other, but are there either practical or philosophical or even spiritual differences in the variations that the verse is in? And it's actually more variations. By the way, on that Rashi thing, so the Torah says 3 times, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And from that, we have 8 sets of dishes in our homes if we keep kosher, right? So the idea that a verse is repeated so many times is itself significant from an interpretive point of view. And this one appears not just these 4 times, but others as well. So if that one little innocent thing about prohibiting an Egyptian cultic practice, last I checked, by the way, chickens don't have milk, so chicken and cheese should be no problem. But right, obviously that's not how halacha has developed. So if one little verse there repeated 3 times has such an impact, I think it is my claim that the fact that this verse appears so many times also should have some sort of significant impact. All right, that's my frame. Does that sound good? We'll probably do 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so on Chavruta, and then we'll come back. So yeah, now's the dating game. You get to pair up with someone you know or don't know. If you, sorry, I forgot this guiding thing. If you've never done Chavruta before, it can be nice to read the text out loud. It just has like part of the vibe.
Should we read this out loud?
Passively follow the first follow that. Yeah, it's kind of like crashed into the
Maybe like 2 minutes, 2 more minutes. Oh yeah, can you? Can you start like playing something like from that music? All right. We hear the dulcet tones of the guitar welcoming us back in. As they say in spiritual land, let the words drop away. Thank you. That was perfect. I want that at all of my sessions from now on. All right. First, just let's start just wide open. Any reactions come out of your Chavruta group, like responses that. Let's just start there with no guiding question.
I was thinking about how we talk about privilege and responsibilities that come with privilege. So it's like, don't oppress the stranger. You grew up in the suburbs. So just
right.
thinking like what is this like extra phrase? What is the value of saying, don't oppress a stranger, you were a stranger or you were a slave?
Almost the opposite of the privilege move, right? Yeah. It's not like calling you out, like, hey, but saying, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I have more on that, but yeah.
And it's distant, right? Every year we are, I was saying, we don't necessarily achieve it, but there's the directions for the Passover Seder to try and really think it and experience, right? That that you were there, right? So that there's an immediacy to this notion that we were strangers, that we were slaves and such. So that is so hard, and as we move away from it, through the centuries, but also as our position, right, of privilege that we have, that many of us have now, it's very hard to maintain that sense of having been strangers, of having been slaves, so that we can then look and have empathy, right, for people.
And I've always felt that I love that comment, and I've always felt it was a little bit bogus. Like we so don't take it seriously. I feel like on Passover, like it gets. We talked about ritual earlier, but it gets so over ritualized. Like the salt water symbolizes the tears, or like we eat a bitter herb and that reminds us of the bitterness. Really, and I'd always kind of. I remember as a kid, but even as an adult, like this is the best we can do. Like. We got the cushions over here, but the bitter herbs over there, and they're even at cross purposes, right? You're like lying down because we're like free people, and then like, I've always wondered like what it would really, should we watch a documentary or something before at the Pesach Seder? Yeah.
Yeah, I think on that note, it also comes off a little funny with like historical research that we've done nowadays. Like we know that like probably. It's more of a mythology than an actual story. Not to say that we haven't been strangers, though. We definitely have been at different points.
Right. That's a great point. Yep.
So we read this text as upping the ante, which with each version, which was interesting. I don't think it struck me as the word for one of these texts. Like, wow, there's actually a lot more to this simplicity than we thought, and also to a couple of points been made that. Passover Seder came up as well. There is a moral obligation with memory. That memory serves as a catalyst for and a demand for action. I think Sheinfeld and others have written about that.
Yeah, there's a lovely thing in I forget who wrote it, but when frequently, not always, but frequently, when the Tanakh and the Bible uses the term when God remembers, it's because God, in the character of God, is taking. The character of God is taking action, right? Is taking action. So like God remembered the promise that God made to the Israelites. Like, had God forgotten? Oh shoot, I forgot. I told them I was going to not let them be slaves. Like, right? That's not the theology of the Bible. It is kind of but it's that it's hearing the cries causes a movement. I think the God of the Bible does feel. I know you guys were talking about empathy. Does feel more or less empathy at different times. And the cries from the Israelites stimulate not just a memory in an intellectual sense, but a memory that translates into action. And there are other examples where the words for memory mean I'm doing something or it's motivating me. Yeah.
So speaking of economy of language, we actually talked about that. The Bible is notoriously apodictic, which for those who don't know the word means like just says. the
Everyone knows
law.
that word, right?
What?
Just kidding. I just made a joke. I was like, oh, everybody knows that word, right?
Meaning it says, it says the law and then just moves on to the next law.
Right.
There's no because after it. And so, like, one of the interesting things in terms of comedy of language, the Bible is actually kind of allergic to becauses. And, like, the rabbis only point out a handful of times it has a because it's so rare, actually. And this is, in my memory, this is the only time where the because is not a rational because, but an empathetic because.
Oh, interesting.
And so it really stands apart and alone from the majority of laws in the whole book for that reason.
Right. Just before really diving into that, because I do want to focus on that, I just remembered that the Second Amendment is that way, right? Most of the Bill of Rights, just like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but the Second Amendment goes out to this whole thing of like, well, necessary, human militia, blah, 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 right to bear arms. But in the last 20 years, like that whole because has been written out, right? So like then the Supreme Court said I forgot the language that they used, but it was like decorative verbiage or something like that. Like it has no meaning whatsoever. Whereas I think like, right, the biblical content, it's like, there's got to be some reason. Like why, what are these, I heard, Daniel, I heard you saying like, what are these words even doing here? Like, if we're putting on our Rashi hat, those of us who know about Rashi, this is like a standard Rashi thing. Like, this is extra words. Like, what are these words doing there?
So,
Yeah.
So we were talking about like the progression and the different times. And one thing that we were talking about is that typically Laikas to the people who came out of Egypt to very much of their children. So talking to different audiences. So the first audience you could say, appeal to their nefesh, the heart. But in the second, you have to kind of just give them a commandment and remind them, I'm the guy who got you out of Egypt, I can take you back if you listen.
Oh, so it's possible to read it as a threat, right? Like, I took you out of Egypt, I'm going to put you right back in there. Which is also, look, there's plenty of theology that says that, right? Right? You're not venerating me, you're going to have some dry crops. Yeah. Which I actually, again, as a child, I remember Passover Seder as kind of having more of that vibe. Like, yeah, but remember, you were nothing, and God brought you. We didn't have, like, it would be nice if, like, the Passover Seder was like, wow, I had this experience. But actually, I remember it's just like, you owe God everything. Yeah.
I just have a question on the Rashi thing. Is it that the economization is within a single sentence, within a verse, or is it meant to be that it's, in the entire text? In other words, is the assertion that this doesn't appear, that it appears in Deuteronomy not by accident? Or
Here, Rashi wouldn't have a problem necessarily with the larger one, the larger duplication because of the variation in the words, but he would definitely have a problem, I think. And there's a wonderful scholar named Nechama Leibowitz who wrote all these books about like what's bothering Rashi in this verse, because Rashi doesn't actually say learning Rashi is really fun actually, because he doesn't say what we've said right now. What are these words doing here? Why is there extra verbiage? He actually just solves the problem, and so it's a puzzle to figure out what the problem is that he's even solving. So he might have a note. I don't actually know the Rashi on this verse, which is bad prep on my part, but he might have a note of like, this is why the text says this, but he doesn't say the problem I'm trying to solve is that the second half of this verse is irrelevant. But that's a standard Rashi move on the micro level, to speak to your exact question. So like the Ten Commandments, which we just heard, don't say like, don't murder. Murdering is wrong. Taking life is bad. Don't murder because I am the Lord and I created life. Or don't covet because that's going to lead to some bad situation. It just says don't do it. Right? And yet here, where it could just as easily say, like, don't oppress the stranger, period. Okay, got it. You're God. I heard you. Message, next commandment. So what are these words doing here in the first version, let's say? We could use any of them, but let's say in the first one.
I just find it really fascinating because it's sort of, for a religion as precedent we have monotheism where there is a God, it's actually locating the source of ethical conduct in the people's lived experience. You can go one more step to get to divine law, obviously, if you say this came from divine law. But I think it's like a radically democratic notion of the divine will is acted out through the lived experience of the people. I think I think it's doing a lot of really interesting work that decenters sort of a God above and locates it into the people. So I think those words are the actions that they're taking.
I love that. We have the rabbi.
Yeah, I mean, one way to answer the question about the purpose of the phrase is that it would make absolutely no sense to the listener why you wouldn't take advantage or oppress those folks. If you're the majority society, we all do it, why wouldn't we do it? And so only until a people has a memory that they were on the bad end of the stick becomes their own, sovereign kind of self-perspective could even conceive of that moral step, if you will.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. There was
if you don't have the phrase, people hearing it would be like, well, why the heck not? Everyone else does. I don't understand why you would even make that case.
Yeah, I love that. It's an interesting paradox in a certain way. So on the one hand, in this theology, which we just enter into the biblical theology world, right? So God created human beings the way we are. And yet this is, I think you're right, there is a very natural animal, it's not even just human, urge to dominate, right? For the dominant group to dominate the lesser group. It's also sort of a gendered urge, right? There's like a male thing, but there's also, right? And if you kind of go down the list, right? The people in weak, marginalized positions, right? That's who, in a sort of Nietzschean, Elon Muskian, philosophy, right? We take advantage of them, right? That's how it is. The strong prey on the weak. So it's like God, on the one hand, created that, I would say, evolutionarily, developed. But let's just say, this human desire to dominate. On the other hand, the God of the Bible clearly says that's not how it's supposed to be. And I think you guys, because I was sitting close to you, there was like this notion of like divine justice, and like when we get to like perverting the justice due, in a certain way, like, well, is justice natural or is justice davka unnatural? Like justice is the part that is not our kind of the set of the factory settings, which is like a language I use from Dan Harris all the time, like your base settings, factory settings, like you have a computer or a device, like these are the settings that are set in there and they're in, like you can't change the factory settings. But Dan's big thing, the way he explains meditation, is like our capacity for goodness, our capacity for kindness are not factory settings. Happiness is not a factory setting. You can actually develop skills for happiness. You can develop skills that build more compassion and more. And so justice here, it seems like injustice might be the factory setting, right? And this pursuit, this justice, which also comes from God. So both come from God, but they contradict each other.
The factory setting language makes me think about this idea that with something like empathy, you have a natural set point. So not everybody has the same factory setting, but then it's like effort or skill to cultivate it. And maybe if you're human beings who have experienced depression, your natural set point is meant to be in a better place. So maybe it's like saying, hey, remember, like you actually can tap into greater kindness if you remember that experience. You're not just like every human being who has only experienced being dominant.
So let's see, I'm tempted to say what I want to say. I agree, I want to respond to you right now, but instead I'm going to call on other voices. Yes, but put a pin in that.
Default, if we remember the idea that it might be that it was ancient peoples who wrote the story, then it would be those people deciding to write a story with these sorts of implications, and then as time goes on, writing these sorts of morals based off of it. So that would argue against it being maybe, because like that's not coming down from any alternative entity if you choose a non.
Well, the historical reality of these text compositions is, right, the Israelites, or the various people who called themselves Israelites, really constituted themselves by these texts. There was no ethnic group of Israelites. There was no separate group, like it's Israelite, Canaanite, mishmash, and often the groups that constituted themselves by these texts and became the children of Israel were in fact in the disadvantaged, the disfavored positions. So this historical memory of being strangers in Egypt might actually be described as, that's the mythical historical memory, the historical experience, the lived experience of many of our ancestors, but the actual ones, meaning like the ones who wrote these texts, as being in marginal positions, certainly relevant to the conquering empires of the time, whether it was Egypt or whether it was Assyria and others, and then later Babylonia, Persia. But they actually had the experience of being oppressed by the stronger powers that were occupying.
But isn't that sometimes maybe we're reading the text upside down? Because it's very good. Like the Japanese are descended from the sun god, and the Islams have everything perfect. And we're one of the few people who have found in texts that we are rabble, we're not divine,
Right? We're the kvetchers.
we make a lot of mistakes, our patriarchs do terrible things, there's lie and deception. And sometimes I wonder if really all these reminders, stranger, strange land, is just like, know your place. You are a holy people, but you're not the best thing since sliced bread here. Don't think that you can lord over everybody and everything at all times. That you know where you are in the world. And again, you're nothing without me.
And again, there's multiple voices, right? There's also the book of Joshua, where like you go right in and wipe everybody else out, and it's the book of genocide. So but in this voice, I think you're right. There's this, this sort of humbling in a certain way, or like remember who you are, who you were. Yeah, 2 more, and then I want to respond to Julie.
Yeah, the way I read this, though, I find that there are other examples of this in the text as well, where it feels to me like there's a setup here for either justification for what they're about to do, which is go in and commit quite a bit of genocide. And so there needs to be this moment of remembering it. It's not just about remember how to treat this. In this case, I think we're all thinking of the stranger as someone who knocks on the door, not someone you encounter as you go in and wipe them out. Those are strangers too. Right? But that's not the context here, right? This is
strangers once you've already set up.
Yeah, I think or not legally, but sort of legally. These are like the people who are not of our group, but who we find ourselves living among.
But there's always this sort of setup of justification of why can you go wipe out a whole bunch of people? Well, because we were enslaved for 400 years. And then
Interesting.
right? And at the same time, there's a code that's happening here that's also protective, because sooner or later, someone bigger is coming. And so it'd be nice to say, well, this is how we live. We live like this. We're nice to strangers, and we have all these laws, and there's a certain amount of fairness that's built into the doctrine. And
This is a cynical comment. That's good. I like it. I'm into it. Yeah.
So we read the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments could be interpreted that this is the way that you behave within your own community. Don't kill anyone in your community, don't steal from anyone in your community, don't covet anything that someone else in your community. And this reminds us that it is not just. So here now we have, shortly following that we're focusing on someone who might be living within the community or just outside, but is not part of our community. That you're not supposed to, those things apply also. That it isn't just about us.
Which it's interesting, a lot of Talmudic law goes in the exact opposite direction. That a lot of the ethical requirements, legal requirements, well, that's only if it's Jews, and then there's all these little wiggle rooms. All right, I'll go to Mark, and then I'm going to respond, but someday I'll respond.
Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that this really does create a kind of ethos to the Torah in general when you take it in aggregate, all of these, because I was watching a lecture a while ago with Shayel talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel. And basically one of the things that he was saying was that, like, Heschel sits down, reads the Bible, and the ethos, like the master story of the Jewish people is like, we have to take care of people, we have to be ethical, and that's how he lived his life, that's his rabbinate. He contrasts that with like Maimonides, who he reads the Torah, and like, if you read Maimonides, like the most important thing for Maimonides seems to kind of be like, don't do idolatry, right? And so that different people can read the Torah and get different ethoses from it. But I do think that like whoever planted the seeds here with these texts really puts a strong emphasis on this as kind of one of the major master narratives because it's so repetitive. And I also think, whether intentional or not, whether they're self-conscious, that more law has to flow from this, because once you put something in writing, you inherently have to legalize afterwards what comes, the inevitable questions that come from putting it in stone. This then lays the claim for later law to come and for a kind of thrust of what later law could be in terms of what it means to, potentially care for the stranger.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, hearing that, I would add like a third character, lahavdil, between Heschel and Maimonides, and I think it would be like Meir Kahana, right? You know, Shaul Magid has done a really wonderful job, I think, of contextualizing Meir Kahana, who, for liberals, like, this is the worst Jew ever, right? Horrible racist, led to, all sorts of extreme, not just right-wing views, like that's to shame the right wing, like, very extremist views. But he came out of the American counterculture, right? And was inspired a lot by Black Power. And was like, hey, we're like a tiny little minority too. We need to defend ourselves, Jewish Defense League. We need to be proactive. The lesson of the Exodus is like, we gotta be strong, right? And you could have a totally different reading from the Exodus narrative, which was kind of similar to what was being said before. Like, we got to be strong because look what happened to us. Like, you were slaves in Egypt, so make sure you're not going to be slaves again. Get yourself an army, and if you got to trample on some human rights, that's too bad, but you got to do that because the strength of it. So it's definitely possible to have a completely opposite read. So here's how I want to propose a reading of the text, that there are actually two commandments in this verse, right? One being, shall not wrong or oppress the stranger. The other being to empathically remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That shows up in the Passover piece, but there seems to be in here, I think, an implicit recognition that it is the default position to oppress, whether it's the stranger, the widow, the orphan, right? These are people who are disempowered, who are other, right? There's an intrinsic drive or human drive to otherize the other and to put the other, to dehumanize the other. Obviously, this is like super politically loaded, and I started teaching it in 2017, not by coincidence, but right, that this is sort of a bit that, yes, there's a sort of almost, some would call it pessimistic, but I mean, it's just a recognition that there are different seeds and faculties in human nature, and the ones that you want to nourish, you have to water. And there has to actually be active work to remember that you too could be strangers in the land of Egypt. So like here in a contemporary vein, right, there's a lot about solidarity. And I've seen it fail so many times, right? So like in the LGBT community, like gays and lesbians, like white gays and lesbians, we had like a really good run for about like 10 years. We won a bunch of rights. And then a lot of us like flipped teams and sided with the people who were oppressing us and are now helping to oppress trans people, right? American Jews, we also were pretty oppressed here for a while. And then like we've had a good like last 30, 40 years. And a lot of us like kind of switched teams. I don't mean partisan teams. I mean like going like, well, yeah, we're now part of the power structure. However, that turns out in terms of electoral politics. That's not my point. We're a part of the power now, and we have the power, and now we actually get to wield that against the other. You know, there was a particular White House advisor who was emblematic of that, right? And so we see the failure of this, I would say, demand to do what I would kind of call a certain kind of spiritual practice, right? And before moving on though, I want to like, so that's like, I'm gonna put that out and let it germinate for a moment. What about the differences in the language? Like, what is there a significant difference between wronging, oppressing, loving the stranger? Like that's sort of, it's funny, it feels like a very Christian verse, right? It's like, oh, the Christians say love your enemies. We say, just don't do to somebody else. Like we have a more realistic view. We say don't do to somebody else what you don't want them to do to you. They say who can love your enemies? Well, actually, sorry to burst the little Jewish supremacy bubble, but right, I mean, here it's as well, like, is there a content difference or is this just rhetorical difference? How'd that come up in Chavrita?
And Shahel's sort of Mark mentioned, says the way to love God is to love the stranger. And I don't think he misses words. That is the only way really to love God. And I think that's pretty profound. And it's embedded in all of this. Yeah, it's a really hard thing to do. But it's the only way if you're serious about loving God.
So what does love mean in that? Like what weight is that carrying here?
That's what I talked about, that you love the stranger, but you still can't give them any of the Passover sacrifice.
So there's a little, this is a hard-edged joke. It's a little bit offensive, and I'm telling it in scare quotes, since that's my metaphor of the evenings, put something in scare quotes. So apologies, especially folks coming from, we good? We're good. Different backgrounds. So why are Jews so tense all the time? Because 2,000 years of Christian love has worn down our nerves. It's a little fierce. I'm not saying it's an okay joke, but it has a certain point in there, right? That love can mean a lot of different things, right? And again, like when I was an activist, we'd get all the time, like, people say we hate gays. We don't love gays. That's why we don't want you to sin. We love you. We don't want you to go to hell. It's an expression of our love to make sure to condemn, right? You hate the sin, but love the sinner. And we do. We love you, me being the homophobe, right? We love you, which is why we don't want you to sin so much. So, like, I don't know. I'm just wondering about what love is doing in this thing.
We were trying to figure out what did wrong or oppress, what else did wrong add to it. And those, of course, are not. So wrong don't oppress, and then love is not a not. And we were talking about how we thought that this idea of love is about something that you have to do. It's something about the way that you treat people. It isn't the emotion that you feel. It's what you do. So that all of these terms are about how you treat other people.
Well, I would just say that I do think, though, that contrary to your joke, that there is some good evidence that V'ahavta is like a word of elevation. You know, I mean, we're supposed to love God. I mean, and here there's a continuum between God, the neighbor, and the stranger. All of these, I'm disinclined to think that we're supposed to like love God the way that whatever homophobe was telling you that they're loving the sinner but not the sin. So.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, I personally agree, but I mean, there is this, you know, we've seen this in rhetoric, right? In anti-gay rhetoric and other rhetoric, like, if you love someone, you want what's best for them, right? If you love someone, and you see that they're falling into a pattern of addiction or self-harmful behavior, you want to stop them from doing that because you love them. Even if they say, I don't have a problem, I'm not addicted, I'm not, like, even so, love can actually sometimes show up in the Jewish context more specifically, like it could show up as tochacha, as rebuke. Like, oh, I see you're kind of going off the derech here and off the path, and like, because I love you, I'm going to call you out. Or
right, but I think that that's a genuine form of love. I mean, whatever, it's what parents do when we get it right, you know. And I think that in that context, that part of what's important about the, you know, because you were strangers, is it's saying like that you actually there is like a true self-interest or a true self-story of relationship. You know, maybe a closer one is like you, now that you're a wealthy Jew who's done well in this country, don't forget that just a generation ago you weren't, you know, or you, now that you have gained, you know, marriage equality, don't forget that, you know, that doesn't give, you need to like pay attention to the rights of transgender individuals. I hear it more like that.
That's, I totally resonate with that. I mean, for me, where I think there might be a textual key to it is the demand, again, kind of for empathy, remembering what it was, even if it's, again, a myth, like what it is to be a slave in Egypt. Like coming from our place, and this connects to what I was saying in the bigger session, that there's the spiritual value of that brokenness. And if we didn't actually experience it, that we should like self-create it. I remember actually at one point, when I was 29, 30 or something like that, I was kind of starting out in like the Jewish spiritual world. My teacher, Rabbi David Cooper, like wrote a little note to Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi to like introduce me. And he wrote this note, and I wanted the note to be like, meet my brilliant student, Jay Michaelson. He is so smart. He has done all of these things. And he said some kind things, like he studied Kabbalah and he's done some meditation, but you know, he also was closeted for 10 years of his adult life, and he's experienced some suffering through that, and and just said that. And I was so insulted. I was like, what? You're introducing me as like the closet case? But now, obviously, I see it the way I think you see it. It's like, don't worry, he's a pretty privileged dude, went to like some Ivy League schools, all that stuff, but he has experienced a little bit of marginalization. Still plenty of privilege, obviously, but also a little bit of what it is to be the other. And that's what strikes me as the answer, in a sense, to that kind of love that oppresses. Right? If we actually imagine ourselves in the humanity of the other who we're othering, it becomes harder and harder to say, like, again, if we have some like cosmological view that they're going to burn in hell forever, but it becomes harder to sort of trample on their rights and say, well, and so you see a lot of dehumanization among oppressors, right? It's like those people don't love their children, or those people are just coming to, they're lying. They're not coming here because they're really in any difficulty in their home country, and they're just coming to America and taking jobs or something, as if they're like cynical manipulators rather than desperate people, risking their lives. And so here, this feels, the second part of the verse in its different forms feels like a commandment not to dehumanize or not to otherize. Like you were also, and if you weren't, then you have to imagine that you were, and try to really inhabit the humanity of the person who was the slave in Egypt. We could turn over the page if you've had enough of this verse in its different forms. So probably a famous quote, although interestingly, usually just the first half at the very bottom from Cornel West, that justice is what, there's a typo. Justice is what love looks like in public. I put the S in the wrong place. Just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. I kind of love that also, like a parallel to the Shemot verse, that there's this extra. So a lot of times just the first half is quoted, and the first half is pretty awesome. Justice is what love looks like in public. That's like best quote of the last 50 years maybe, right? That's a good quote. But I feel it's richer actually with the second part included in it. It's like we know, we might know, hopefully we know or can know at some point, or knew in some point, what tenderness feels like. Right? And there's these different faces of love. And if we can get in touch with that tenderness can then manifest in our public lives, not as inappropriate tenderness in the public space, but as justice motivated by that same kind of love. So for me, I feel like the reason I find this verse to be like the skeleton key to to my whole life. So, I have this kind of bifurcated life where I do spiritual teaching on the one hand, but journalism on the other. And so the joke when I was teaching meditation was like, I stress people out with my journalism and then relax them with my meditation. But the actual interface for me is that it feels to me, and I've kind of staked a lot on this view, that if there's a real contemplative practice of developing empathy and compassion, that makes it a lot harder, more difficult to harden the heart. Right? This verse in its different forms feels like the opposite of when Pharaoh hardens his heart, and he's like, I am not going to, you got to break. What did Dick Cheney say before? Right? It's like you got to go to the text, go to the dark side sometimes if you want to win the war, and that's how he explained steeling yourself to put up with torture. Like to me, that also happens in line with the Cornel West quote in a moment by moment basis. When we come across the difficult parts in our own experience, where there's something that's hard or difficult, if we discover self-hatred or hatred for somebody else, like to actually feel that feels like the soil from which this kind of justice love might grow. I love, probably a lot of people know Cornel West. The person above him is Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, who's a wonderful Zen Buddhist teacher. African-American background, queer identified as well. And she just has this wonderful line of, it is a misinterpretation to suppose that attending to the fires of our existence cannot lead us to experience the waters of peace. Here she's talking about the waters of peace more than the waters of empathy, but I feel like those two kind of go together. Like it's precisely by attending to where we see the fires of our existence, where there's tension, where there's burning up, where there might be anger. Like it's by attending to those and making space for them and looking into them, that's where there's kind of spiritual growth, I guess, might actually kind of happen. Let's see if there's another space from another comment from others. Otherwise, I'm going to do Foucault. So I love Foucault, the French philosopher, is not usually put out there as a great spiritual teacher, but he was asked what is spirituality, and he said it is, that's why it's quoted this way, the search, the practice, the experience by which the subject operates on oneself, the transformations necessary to access the truth. I think that's really provocative, especially knowing a little bit about how that showed up in his own life in terms of pretty radical experimentation in different ways. But so that the subject operates on oneself the transformations necessary to access the truth. So there's, again, in these verses, there seems to be this basic understanding of a sort of initial starting point of I am now in a strong position, therefore I otherize and oppress the other. But if there's a process to see the truth of one's own precarity and one's own vulnerability, right? That should have a consequence. Like that's how, what's always struck me as frustrating with these ethical teachings in the Jewish tradition, particularly in the Torah itself, is like, I get the what, but not the how. Like, okay, how do I do this? Like, I would like to be a better person. I would like to not oppress the stranger. So, okay, I remember intellectually that I was a slave in the land of Egypt, not literally, but how do I do that?
Yeah, I think you see it even more pronounced today, where when something happens and you're like, well, that happened to me in my life. I dealt with it. You can deal with it too, or I'm going to do it to you because it toughened me up. Or you could go, right? Then you hear that, right? You hear that from people. But then there's the, oh my gosh, I experienced that too. I wish somebody had done this for me when I experienced that. And you have that. When you work on yourself and you work through that trauma, you're able to help other people through that trauma rather than re-inflicting it on somebody.
And yet it feels like it takes a lot of avodah, right? Like that takes a lot of work. So like for now almost 35 years, I've just been obsessed with the question of how we change or how we grow. And the data is really pessimistic. Like it helps to be gay, by the way. That's a great way, right? Because you like came up in a particular society but now that there's more acceptance, that's probably fallen by the wayside. But unless you actually have some trauma where you see the misfit between your reality and what your social community is telling you is true, right? It seems almost impossible. Like the data is like, it just doesn't happen. Like this is a wish I'm sorry to be a downer at 1 a.m, but like there's a wish here that we can inhabit our own vulnerability enough such that we would not oppress another. But the 21st century data is like, it doesn't seem to work. So the classic story that I told, so when I wrote that book, God versus Gay, a bunch of years ago, so I had like the speech, and I was an activist, so I gave the same speech, I counted 103 times, and it was great. I was at synagogues, I was at churches, and it was all, the thesis of the book is like, the majority of our religious values support full inclusion of LGBTQ people. Yes, there are these 2 verses, but we always interpret verses according to our deeper values, and our deeper values all lead in this direction. And I went through it in detail, like it's not good to be alone, and something about real love and compassion and justice and so forth. And I ended that book talk in the same way every time, which was the scene in Huck Finn, where, so Huck has been told by his society that, so it's obviously 19th century, racist is an understatement, right? Slavery, if you help a runaway slave, you're gonna go to hell. Like that's what he's been told. And so, but he's had an experience with a runaway slave, with Jim, where Jim saves his life and they're floating down the Mississippi and he's had all of these adventures. And he can't reconcile these 2 claims. Either he has to turn, and he has to decide because he has an opportunity to turn Jim in. And the way that Mark Twain writes it, Huck does decide to turn him in. He's like, I decided I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna report Jim. He's gonna be turned away, knowing full well that Jim will either be sent back to slavery or killed. Right? I'm going to do it. And he said, I felt good and clean and washed clean of sin for the first time in my life, is the way that it's written in the book. But then Mark Twain says, but then I went on thinking, right? And what he doesn't really think, he remembers, exactly as in the verse, all of the adventures and experiences. And it's a love story also, right? Jim, a platonic love story. Like there's this love between these 2 people. And Huck remembers that. And how he's gotten, and he even says how Jim would call me honey and be very sweet. It's this very kind of lovely 19th century romantic thing. And so he said, I was betwixt, I didn't know what to do. And so he says, and he had written a letter turning Jim in, saying where they were hiding. He said, I decided, well, I guess I'll go to hell then. And he tears up the letter, right? And that's that moral change, right? Of course, we know as the reader, right, this isn't Huck going to hell, right? This is Huck becoming a moral human being, rising above his own society, which has told him very clearly this horrifying message, right? And for me, that's this moment of conscience formation that a lot of our some of our justice-y debates invite as a spiritual gift, right? So, I mean, I grew up with plenty of racist ideas, and I'm still, animated by some of them, I'm sure. But like, that's the work, is to work on that, right? Like, that's the invitation, is to grow, like not to sort of use that as an excuse or whatever, but to say like, yeah, this is here. This is how I grew up. I grew up in the 80s in the South, and I certainly had transphobic ideas. I had anti-gay ideas. I had anti-everybody ideas. I mean, This is what we begin to do the work with, but that's not the end point, right? That's the beginning. That to me is what is the key for this spirituality, social justice intersection, that the second part of the verse enables the first to happen in a way that so far there's just not a lot of data that anything works to do that, absent that lived experience that seems to be the invitation.
So, I mean, I guess I feel like the reason that we could indefinitely for the rest of human existence talk about this is that othering...
We're ending in 6 minutes.
Othering... I'm staying up all night, I don't know about you. Othering is an ongoing process forever and ever. So as soon as you're saying, I'm going to tear this up, I'm not a racist anymore, you're now othering, right? And which is good. I mean, right?
Which
so
he didn't say. He didn't say I'm done
involved.
with my work. But
Right.
yes, I
But
get
like,
it. Yeah.
Right, but like in whatever context we want to put it in, it's you know, and so then you're othering someone else, which is not necessarily all bad, right? So like othering someone who's unethical, but it's still an othering. So then you know, then we say like, okay, so do we go into the deep south and interact with people and find out why they're voting the way they're voting, and like, you know, and continue this process of loving the other, which is really, really different to me than like passively, like you described the other ones as you could passively not do these things, all of the other ones, but it's not just like it's not just like a positive and negative command. It's like it's really like you could do those things, observe those passively by not doing them.
Right, you could just
But the
cause no
action-
harm.
Even the
Right.
act, right, exactly. But the action of loving, or the action is it automatically others someone else. Like relationship building ends up othering someone in some other way because it creates a boundary.
Just thinking about this. There's this. Okay, got to start back with the primates. So we start off with a troop of like 120, and they're borders. The men do not cross the borders. The females cross the borders. The men do not. So if there's a man in your territory, you attack. If you're a man in someone else's territory, they attack you. So it took collective hunting or collective agriculture to get beyond that stage of human existence. And that's where, like, you can then decide, are we going to be tribal or are we going to be more cosmopolitan? And it seems like these phrases are saying to me, the ethos of this place, which happens to be like a trade route, is going to be more cosmopolitan. And maybe it's a reflection of that idea about what is it for humans to live together, or to allow for some more porousness. And maybe that's a good thing.
I mean, it does feel to me like a variation on the defining question of our time, right? Where in the last 10 years we've seen I was shocked. It was funny when Brexit happened in 2016, I probably put on Facebook, Trump's going to win the election. And my friends were like, you're crazy, he's a clown, this will never happen. And I was like, there's clearly something happening, right? And, you know, maybe it's sort of a backlash to cosmopolitanism or to tech or to globalization or to diversity or to changes in population patterns. But like, it feels like we're in a moment where this verse, my so-called favorite verse of the Torah, is like the survival verse or not, right? And I don't even need to we're facing it in Israel as well, but like we're facing it in Russia, we're facing it here, we're facing it in Europe, we're facing it in China, we're soon to be facing it China, Taiwan. Like it feels like a global, or almost global, not to exclude certain continents, like an almost global wrestling with this question of what is our relationship to the other. And, you know, so the weirdest thing I've ever done media-wise was the Tablet podcast Unorthodox, and I was on with Liel Leibowitz, who's like pretty hard right. And I don't believe in I have some boundaries, but like I'll basically go on a podcast even if it's somebody who has views that I strong. And we had this like deep dive, and we got to this point after an hour and a half. I don't know if anybody ever listens to podcasts for this long, where he's just like, "This is my team. Like the Jews are my team, and this is how human beings are. This is how human beings have always been, and I'm going to root for my team even when my team is wrong. And the fact that he's telling this to me, don't do that, that makes you morally wrong. Like you don't get that we are that human beings, our animals, our primates, we are in groups, and we should root for our group, and that is what helps humanity grow, is when all of us push for our groups, and we compete, and we fight, and we this, and we that." And I tried like pushing him. I gave him an example. There was a horrible incident one time where there was a targeted assassination in Bethlehem, and they got the wrong guy, and they killed this entire family. And this wasn't like some random violence. This was a planned action, and it went horribly wrong. I was like, okay, so if that's the price, are you still willing to root for the team? Like, this is horrible. Like, this is how could, and he's like, I am going to root for my team. And like, yes, sometimes horrible things will happen, but I am not going to let my people down the way that you are. And it was a rare moment because there was nothing I could say or do we weren't there to persuade each other, but I couldn't even counter that. Like I didn't have a reply. It was just like a fundamentally different way of seeing the moral universe. And I still, to this day, that was several years ago, and I just feel totally powerless. I mean, I can show him texts, but he could show me texts, right? So that's not going to do it. And I felt powerless to counter what I felt in my opinion, was like evil. Like I felt it was like profoundly ethically evil what he was saying. Maybe one or two more comments and then we're all done.
Well, I believe there are studies showing that a greater amount of diversity in a city or a town actually does increase and create better circumstances for the people living, and even sometimes over time, even like greater communal trust.
Yeah, I don't know about those studies. I believe you. I'm just going to take it on face value. There would still be a claim that, there's a pretty strong claim in the nationalist right that multiculturalism never works. It basically, and like you point to history, like when has it ever worked? And there's always been a dominant group, and that's how humans are. So I take your point and throw another unnamed study back at you. So as Julie said at the end of her session, I don't have a bow to tie this up on. I know that for myself, when I do my own spiritual practice, whether it's meditation or prayer, any of the other things I talked about earlier, the necessity, for me, compassion flows from wisdom. And like when there's a moment of awareness and awakeness, compassion naturally flows. And for about 10 years of my teaching life, I thought that was true for everybody. And that's one reason I taught meditation. I was like, well, how do we soften hearts? How do we open hearts? Well, meditation is going to be one of those ways to do it, and I'm good at it, so I'm going to focus on that. And over the last few years, I've really entered a period of uncertainty around that. And now I don't think it's impossible to open and soften hearts, but I don't know what the answer is. Work to you. Well, that's tough.
Good night.
Thanks, Rabbi. It's great.
We have the wine on the porch, then
You did it! Are you okay?
You know, I don't drink caffeine, and I
Right. Okay, then, all right, so I won't see you Saturday.
And I just knew that.
Yeah, if you want to, we do the whole thing in Pastor like
It's great.
that's not really how you do it. How you do it is go travel. Sort of like it's not the first thing where you're like, and I'm not saying like you create a false sense of equivalency between the two things, but I think that
the non-crazy Tikkun. I mean, there's definitely a moment. Anytime the
I
right
don't think they're both
widely
important. Like, I think
overshoots,
both
like in Florida
is you have to some ritual work.
And it's funny because like I have friends who are transfixed from they should be scared too. And this overreach is so maybe it's possible to reach those center right voters because the hard right's just gone so batshit. And like, and they're so ideological that they don't seem to read the polls, right? Like they're such true believers, like, you know, sort of in our old days, you know, we might have our beliefs, and so we also do the cross. We're going to use this message. So we'll say love is loud.
And I think that
there were these guys who
consulting about the team. They say this super right. Like I mean, there's just some.
But I don't know. Yeah, the only thing that peak experience seems to work. Lots of
being in politics for a long time, I just like realized at some point.
But there's so many, there's so many douchebags that are psychedelics now. Even that is well, it is interesting. I'm really interested in the psychedelics.
But I think that
because I also like.
Thank you. I'll speak up.
Just like speaking of psychedelic. Just like I had the naive meditation. I had the, yeah, there was a sign. There's a. I have that.
The point is like in that group, the team, there's people who are like Monicans and them of like softness. And this is like my guy.
And the data is not.
And he would tell stories.
And
I
some do, but others just have their priors. One of their tools, so they're always like, you know, like Peter Thiel.
So that's why I like. Look, I love the ritual parts, right?
And others like him. And
it's like has to be.
I don't know. I don't actually understand Peter Thiel. And I love that dude. I mean, I have. If you think about it,
I don't know. I followed him from the tech side.
And I think that's like a super big part of it.
Yeah,
but
I mean, his
I think
support of
there's
Trump
like
other
seem to
people
be
basically like a kind of chaos
that are about
it's just like this
and I think that what I was pushing on there's a sort of like this ritual
his
vision,
vision, his utopian vision is a pure like Randy and
ethical action part
and
of it.
so that's how
just
it
about
dovetails with
isn't
his
about
own
like
sexuality.
sometimes
it's like, well, that's fine in my world, everybody
but
like
it's
struggle.
you know, I don't know. This is why I want to have you really what is it that makes sense of things to do so that they're doing those combines, like dealing with this stuff.
The tragic fact of Peter Thiel is I have friends who, when he was a little younger, he had very wild friends, and I have friends who went, and all kinds of damning
metaphor. Exactly.
Yes.
We're gonna do this. We're gonna like weave this whole thing into then look at what the hell are these weird old guys talking about? I mean, you think that already most of them anyway, right?
Yeah.
Exploitation, not just like
Sorry, I gotta help
sexual exploitation, traffic, like that would be traffic, super young, super young, and like drug fueled crazy parties on fire. And I'm still waiting for him to. Every so often I'm like, come on. Every time Peter Thiel does something evil, I'm like, come on, just let me tell the story.
You want to break it.
Plus, yeah, that'd be good for me. But